President Ignacy Mościcki stood in his office in Warsaw at 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, staring at reports he could hardly believe were real. German bombs were falling on Polish cities. German tanks were crossing the border from 3 different directions. And in his hand was a phone message from the German ambassador that had been delivered just hours earlier. Germany wanted to negotiate the return of Danzig. Now, less than 4 hours after that diplomatic message, the Wehrmacht was already deep inside Polish territory. Mościcki had been Poland's president for 13 years. He had survived the chaos of the 1920s, navigated the complex politics of the 1930s, and had watched Germany grow increasingly aggressive. But even as late as August 31, just yesterday, Polish military intelligence had reassured him that Germany would not risk a full-scale invasion without provocation. "They're bluffing," his advisors had told him. "Britain and France have guaranteed our borders. Hitler won't dare start a two-front war." Yet here he was, watching Warsaw burn from German aerial bombardment while the sun was barely rising on the first day of September. What President Mościcki didn't know was that at that exact moment, Adolf Hitler was in his headquarters, watching the clock and waiting for confirmation that his forces had achieved their objectives. The German dictator had planned this invasion down to the minute. He had massed 1.5 million German troops on Poland's borders, and while Polish intelligence had correctly reported much of this buildup, the government underestimated the speed and brutality of what was about to come. And Hitler had one more secret that would destroy any hope of Polish resistance, a secret pact with Joseph Stalin that would split Poland in half before the month was over. But here's what makes this story truly devastating: Poland wasn't some small, defenseless country that could be crushed without a fight. Poland had mobilized around 1 million soldiers, and at the start of September nearly 600,000 were ready in the field. This was not a nation unprepared for war. They had fought and won against the Soviet Union in 1920. Their cavalry was highly mobile, their soldiers were brave, and their generals had drawn up defensive plans they believed could hold long enough for Britain and France to intervene. Polish leaders genuinely believed they could resist for months, maybe even longer, if only they could survive the initial German assault until their allies launched an offensive from the west. Yet in just 27 days, Poland would cease to exist as an independent nation. The speed of their collapse would shock the entire world and prove that everything military experts thought they knew about modern warfare was obsolete. How could a proud nation of 35 million people, with a strong army and defensive positions, be broken so quickly? The answer would rewrite the rules of warfare and terrify every remaining free nation in Europe. The first sign that this wouldn't be a conventional war came at 4:40 a.m., 5 minutes before President Mościcki received the first reports. German Stuka dive bombers screamed down on the Polish town of Wielin, a small city with no military value whatsoever. The bombers systematically destroyed the town's hospital, marked with a giant red cross that was visible from the air. Civilian casualties were enormous, estimates range from several hundred to more than 1,000 dead, in the first hour of the war. The attack had no military purpose except one: terror. This was Germany's new approach to warfare. The Wehrmacht wasn't just trying to defeat the Polish military, they were trying to break Polish civilian morale so completely that resistance would become psychologically impossible. As the sun rose on September 1, German aircraft were bombing cities across Poland, not only military bases or fortifications, but civilian population centers. The strategy was designed to create mass panic and refugee columns that would clog Polish roads and prevent military units from reaching their defensive positions. Marshal Edward, Poland's commander-in-chief, was trying to coordinate his forces from his headquarters when the reports started flooding in. German forces weren't just attacking, they were attacking everywhere simultaneously. The Wehrmacht had launched a coordinated assault along Poland's entire western and northern borders, from East Prussia in the north to Slovakia in the south. Every Polish defensive position was under assault at the same time, and Rydz Smigly was trying to determine which attacks were feints and which were the main German thrust. What the Marshal didn't realize was that they were all main thrusts. The Germans had developed a new military doctrine called Blitzkrieg, lightning war, that concentrated massive force at multiple points simultaneously. Instead of the slow, grinding advances of World War I, German forces were punching through Polish defensive lines with concentrated panzer columns supported by dive bombers acting as flying artillery. Polish defenders would find themselves surrounded and cut off before they even realized the front line had shifted. By noon on September 1, less than 8 hours into the invasion, German forces had advanced over 30 miles into Polish territory in multiple locations. Polish cavalry units, highly mobile and experienced, tried to counterattack, but they quickly discovered that their tactics were designed for the previous war, not this one. Contrary to Nazi propaganda, they did not charge tanks with lances, but they were forced to fight against an enemy that moved faster and hit harder than anything in military history. But the most devastating realization came when Polish commanders tried to call for air support. Unlike the common myth, the Polish Air Force was not destroyed on the ground in the first hour, it had been dispersed to secret airfields before the war began. Polish pilots fought valiantly, shooting down hundreds of German aircraft. But they were outnumbered 10-1, flying older planes against Germany's modern air fleet. Within 2 weeks, Poland's air defenses were overwhelmed, and the skies belonged to the Luftwaffe. President Moskiewicz convened an emergency cabinet meeting on September 2, trying to make sense of reports that seemed impossible. German forces had advanced further in 1 day than military planning assumed they could advance in a week. Polish defensive lines that were supposed to hold for months had been bypassed or destroyed in hours. And the promised British and French offensive against Germany from the west, the attack that was supposed to force Germany to divide its forces, hadn't materialized. What the Polish government didn't know was that Britain and France, despite their guarantees, had no immediate plans to launch a decisive strike. France did make a limited move, the so-called Saar offensive, but it was cautious, half-hearted, and quickly withdrawn. French military doctrine was built around static defense and slow preparation. The idea of a rapid offensive to relieve pressure on Poland contradicted everything French generals believed about warfare. So while Poland burned, French forces mostly sat behind the Maginot Line, waiting for Germany to attack them. By September 6, just 5 days into the invasion, German forces were approaching Warsaw. Polish commanders couldn't believe the speed of the advance. Their defensive plans had assumed that Germany would need weeks to break through border defenses and reach the capital. Instead, German panzer columns had simply driven around Polish fortifications, leaving them isolated and useless while the main thrust continued toward Warsaw. Marshal Rydz Smigly ordered the evacuation of the government from Warsaw on September 6. President Moskiewicz and the cabinet fled southeast toward Lublin, hoping to establish a defensible position where they could reorganize Polish forces and continue resistance. But even as the Polish government was evacuating, the situation was about to become catastrophically worse. What none of the Polish leaders could stop was the secret agreement signed in August 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that divided Eastern Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union. Poland was to be split roughly in half, with Germany taking the western portions and the Soviet Union taking the eastern territories. Polish intelligence had already warned that the Soviets might intervene, but no one knew the exact timing. On September 17, just 16 days after the German invasion began, the Soviet Union struck. Red Army forces poured across Poland's eastern border. Polish forces that had been retreating eastward, hoping to establish a defensive line and continue resistance, suddenly found themselves attacked from behind. Poland was now fighting a two-front war against the two most powerful military forces in Europe, and Polish commanders finally realized their situation was completely hopeless. The Soviet invasion was the final blow that shattered any hope of continued resistance. Polish forces in the east, which had remained relatively intact because they hadn't faced the full force of the German assault, now found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed. And the Polish government, retreating southeast toward what they hoped would be safe territory, discovered they were heading directly into the path of the advancing Soviet army. President Moskiewicz and Marshal Rydz Smigly found themselves trapped between two invading armies with nowhere to go. The Romanian bridgehead, Poland's southeastern corner where they had hoped to establish a final defensive position, was rapidly being overrun by Soviet forces advancing from the east and German forces pursuing from the west. The Polish government faced an impossible choice: surrender to Germany, surrender to the Soviet Union, or flee into exile and abandon their country entirely. On September 17, as Soviet forces poured across Poland's eastern border, Rydz Smigly issued orders that he knew meant the end of organized resistance. He instructed Polish forces to retreat toward Romania and Hungary, where they might be interned but at least would not be destroyed by German or Soviet armies. It was an admission that Poland had lost the war, and the speed of that loss was something no one had imagined. Warsaw, surrounded and under constant bombardment, continued to resist even after the Polish government had fled and the Soviets had joined the invasion. The city's defenders, under General Julius Rommel, refused German demands to surrender and fought street by street against overwhelming German forces. For the citizens of Warsaw, surrender meant occupation by a regime that had already demonstrated its brutality in conquered lands. They chose to fight, even knowing their resistance was ultimately doomed. The siege of Warsaw became a symbol of Polish bravery and German ruthlessness. The Luftwaffe conducted concentrated bombing raids on civilian districts, deliberately targeting residential areas to break morale. German artillery pounded the city day and night. Yet Warsaw's defenders held out for weeks, long after the rest of Poland had fallen. The city finally surrendered on September 27, exactly 27 days after the invasion began, but only after German forces had reduced much of it to rubble. As Warsaw surrendered, President Moszkicki crossed into Romania and was immediately interned by Romanian authorities under pressure from Germany. Marshal Rydz Smigly also fled to Romania, where he too was interned. A Polish government in exile was quickly established, first in Paris and later in London, but the Poland they had governed was gone. In just 27 days, Poland had been conquered, divided, and occupied. The speed and completeness of Poland's defeat shocked military observers around the world. France and Britain, which had guaranteed Polish independence, realized too late that their doctrines and preparations were obsolete. The Blitzkrieg tactics that destroyed Poland in less than a month would soon be turned against Western Europe, with similarly devastating results. The fall of Poland was a preview of how quickly modern warfare could annihilate even prepared nations. For the Polish people, the 27-day war was just the beginning of a nightmare that would last 6 years. Under German and Soviet occupation, Poland would lose approximately 6 million citizens, roughly 17% of its pre-war population, making it one of the nations that suffered most during World War II. The speed with which their country fell made the subsequent suffering even more traumatic, as citizens struggled to comprehend how their nation had gone from independence to occupation in less than a month. Polish leaders who survived the war would spend the rest of their lives analyzing how defeat had come so swiftly. Some blamed themselves for not modernizing fast enough. Others blamed Britain and France for failing to deliver on their promises. But the fundamental truth was that Poland had been caught between two totalitarian powers that had secretly agreed to carve up Eastern Europe, and no amount of Polish bravery could have prevented that outcome. The story of how Poland fell in 27 days became a cautionary tale about the dangers of appeasement, the speed of modern warfare, and the ruthlessness of totalitarian regimes. It showed that in the modern world, even courageous nations with proud military traditions could be overwhelmed by enemies using new methods of total war. And it proved that geography and defensive fortifications meant nothing when facing enemies striking from multiple directions with overwhelming force. September 1939 would be remembered as the month that changed everything, when the world learned that the old rules of warfare no longer applied, when the fragile peace of the interwar period finally shattered, and when millions discovered that their fates could be decided by secret pacts between dictators who saw nations as pieces on a geopolitical chessboard. Polish leaders couldn't believe that Hitler and Stalin had conquered their country in just 27 days, but by the time they understood what had happened, their nation had already been swallowed by history.